He was a sickly, asthmatic child who could barely breathe through the night, yet he would become a cowboy, a war hero, an explorer, and the youngest president in American history. Theodore Roosevelt lived more in one lifetime than most could imagine in 10. He charged up enemy hills, wrestled the most powerful corporations on Earth, and saved millions of acres of wilderness for generations yet unborn. "Speak softly," he famously said, "and carry a big stick." He was a force of nature in human form, restless, fearless, and utterly unstoppable. This is the story of a frail boy who refused to accept his limits and through sheer will remade himself and his nation. Theodore Roosevelt was born in 1858 into a wealthy New York family, but his childhood was a battle for breath. Crippling asthma left him weak and bedridden, gasping through long and frightening nights. He was small, nearsighted, and fragile, but his father gave him advice that would shape his entire life. "You have the mind," he said, "but not the body. You must make your body." The young Theodore took those words as a sacred command. With fierce determination, he threw himself into exercise, boxing, and the outdoors, slowly forging strength out of weakness. The frail boy, who once feared the night, was learning a lesson he would never forget, that willpower could conquer almost anything. Roosevelt devoured the world with relentless hunger. He read books by the hundreds, studied nature obsessively, and entered Harvard bursting with energy. He boxed, he rode, he hiked, embracing what he called the strenuous life, the belief that struggle and effort were the only path to greatness. He believed a man should seek out hardship, not avoid it. Whether in the lecture hall or the boxing ring, Theodore attacked every challenge with the same ferocious intensity. By the time he graduated, he had transformed himself completely, from a frail invalid into a vigorous young man overflowing with ambition. He married, entered politics, and seemed destined for a swift and brilliant rise. But fate was about to deal him a devastating blow. On a single dark day in February 1884, Theodore Roosevelt's world collapsed. In the same house, within hours of each other, both his beloved wife and his mother died. He was just 25 years old. In his diary that night, he drew a heavy black cross and wrote only 7 words. "The light has gone out of my life." Shattered by grief, he abandoned politics and fled west to the rugged Badlands of the Dakota Territory. There, in the vast and brutal wilderness, he sought to lose himself and somehow to heal. The polished young politician would trade his fine suits for the rough and lonely life of a frontier cowboy. In the Dakota Badlands, Roosevelt remade himself once again. He bought a ranch, herded cattle, and rode for days across the open plains. He hunted, endured savage blizzards, and even captured armed outlaws at gunpoint. The Eastern aristocrat slowly earned the hard respect of weathered frontiersmen who had once mocked him. The wild, punishing landscape toughened his body and steadied his broken spirit. Out there beneath enormous skies, surrounded by untamed nature, Theodore discovered a deep love for the American wilderness that would one day define his legacy. When he finally returned east, he was no longer just a grieving young man. He was harder, wiser, and ready to throw himself back into the arena of public life. When war with Spain erupted in 1898, Roosevelt refused to watch from the sidelines. He resigned his post in the Navy Department and raised his own volunteer cavalry regiment, a wild mix of cowboys, athletes, and adventurers the newspapers called the Rough Riders. In Cuba, he led them in a furious charge up San Juan Hill, riding straight into a storm of bullets with reckless courage. The charge made him a national hero overnight. His name was suddenly on every front page in America. Theodore Roosevelt had found the stage he was born for and the nation had found a new and irresistible champion. There would be no stopping him now. Riding his fame, Roosevelt became governor of New York and then vice president of the United States. Powerful party bosses, desperate to bury his reform crusade, pushed him into the office believing it powerless. But fate intervened. In September 1901, President McKinley was assassinated. At just 42 years old, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history. The bosses were horrified. The restless reformer they had tried to sideline now held the highest office in the land. He brought to the White House the same boundless energy that had defined his entire life, and he was determined to use every ounce of its power. Roosevelt believed government should protect ordinary people from the abuses of the powerful. In an age of mighty corporations and ruthless monopolies, he became known as the Great Trustbuster, taking on the railroad and oil giants that dominated the nation. He promised every American what he called a square deal, a fair chance regardless of wealth or birth. When coal miners went on strike, he intervened on the side of the workers, something no president had ever dared to do. He fought to regulate industry, protect consumers, and curb the raw power of money in politics. To millions of ordinary citizens, Theodore Roosevelt was a fearless champion who finally fought for them. Of all his achievements, Roosevelt treasured one above the rest. Haunted by the wild beauty he had found in the Badlands, he used the power of the presidency to protect the American wilderness on a scale never seen before. He created national forests, wildlife refuges, and monuments, and championed the great national parks. Standing before the Grand Canyon, he urged his countrymen to leave it as it is, to preserve it for their children and their children's children. In all, he protected some 230 million acres of public land, an area larger than many nations. It was perhaps his greatest and most enduring gift, a wilderness saved for all generations to come. Even out of office, Roosevelt could never sit still. He hunted big game across Africa, then plunged into the uncharted Amazon, nearly dying of fever on a river so dangerous it was called the River of Doubt. In 1912, he ran for president once more, and while giving a speech, he was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin. Incredibly, he refused to stop. With a bullet lodged near his lung, he spoke for 90 more minutes, declaring it would take more than that to kill a bull moose. He survived, but his furious pace had finally worn him down. In January 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep, his restless heart at last brought to rest. Theodore Roosevelt, the frail boy who became a force of nature and carved his spirit into the soul of a nation.